Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the final ride of Pancho Villa. We find ourselves in the state of Chihuahua, where the horizon stretches into a pale, hazy blue and the earth is the color of toasted corn. It is the morning of July 20th, 1923. The air is already heavy with a dry, creeping heat that promises a long, weary afternoon. In this stillness, there is a sense of finality, though the man at the center of our story does not yet feel its weight. He is a figure of legend, a man of war who has finally found a fragile sort of peace. As we begin our journey, imagine the soft, rhythmic sound of a waking town. The world is slow, quiet, and bathed in the first golden rays of a sun that has seen 1,000 battles. The city of Parral is a place of narrow, winding streets and ancient adobe walls that have absorbed the secrets of centuries. It is a city built on silver, its foundations deep within the rocky earth of northern Mexico. On this particular Friday morning, the dust hangs suspended in the air like a fine, glittering veil. You can hear the faint, melodic ringing of church bells in the distance, calling the faithful to early prayer. There is the scent of wood smoke and roasted coffee drifting from the small homes that line the cobblestone paths. The shadows are long and cool, clinging to the corners of the plazas before the midday sun burns them away. It is a mundane morning, filled with the ordinary sights of merchants opening their doors and neighbors greeting one another with soft, rhythmic murmurs as they prepare for the day. Moving through this quiet landscape is a machine that seems almost out of place in such a timeless setting. It is a 1919 Dodge Brothers touring car, its body painted a deep, lustrous black that catches the morning light. The metal is warm to the touch, and the large, rounded fenders curve over the wheels like the wings of a resting beetle. Inside, the leather seats are soft and worn, smelling of old hide and the faint, sweet scent of gasoline. The engine hums with a steady, mechanical heartbeat, a low vibration that travels through the floorboards and into the souls of those inside. It is a modern marvel, a symbol of a world that is changing faster than the dusty roads can keep up with. Each turn of the heavy wooden-spoked wheels brings the car deeper into the heart of Parral, leaving a trail of drifting silt. Behind the wheel sits the man himself, Francisco Villa, known to the world as Pancho. At 45 years old, the fire of the revolution seems to have settled into a steady, quiet glow. He is dressed simply, perhaps more like a rancher than a general, his hands steady on the steering wheel. He had spent the last few years on his vast estate, tending to the land and the people who lived upon it. For a man who had spent a lifetime in the saddle, fleeing through the mountains and leading charges across smoke-filled battlefields, this quiet life was a luxury he had earned through grit. He believed, perhaps naively, that his enemies had moved on, or that the amnesty he negotiated would hold like a sacred vow. On this morning, his mind is not on war. He is thinking of the simple business of a rancher at peace. Beside him and in the back seat are his most trusted companions, though they are few in number on this day. Usually, he is surrounded by 50 of his fiercest guards, the legendary bodyguards who would die for a single nod of his head. But today, the feeling of safety is so thick in the air that he has brought only a handful. There is his personal secretary and 3 loyal guards. They sit comfortably, the wind rushing past the open sides of the car, cooling their skin against the rising temperature. They talk in low voices, their laughter lost to the wind and the drone of the motor. They are relaxed, their weapons resting nearby but not held with tension. They watch the colorful facades of the buildings slide by, blinking in the brilliance of the sun, feeling as though the dangerous years are finally behind them. As the car approaches the intersection of Benito, Juarez, and Gabino Barreda, the world seems to hold its breath. The heat has intensified, creating a shimmering mirage on the road ahead. The sound of the engine reflects off the close-set walls of the houses, creating a rhythmic echo that follows them like a ghost. A vendor stands on the street corner, his cart filled with pumpkin seeds, watching the black car approach with a steady gaze. The dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierce the narrow gaps between the rooftops. Everything is bathed in a soft, hazy glow, a beautiful and terrifying stillness that precedes a great storm. Villa shifts gears, the mechanical click sounding sharp in the quiet morning. For a few more heartbeats, the dust remains settled, the air remains sweet, and he feels entirely, perfectly safe. The morning of July 20, 1923, dawned with a heavy, golden heat that seemed to press down upon the town of Parral. At 7:50 in the morning, the air was already thick with the scent of dry earth and the faint, sweet aroma of blooming desert flora. Pancho Villa sat behind the wheel of his black 1919 Dodge touring car, his hands steady on the steering wheel. He was a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, but in these later years, he had found a new kind of freedom in the rumble of an engine and the steady pace of an automobile. Beside him sat his trusted secretary, Colonel Miguel Trillo, and in the back, 4 of his most loyal companions watched the dusty streets of Chihuahua roll by. They were leaving the city, heading toward the piece of his sprawling hacienda at Canutillo, unaware that every rotation of the tires brought them closer to a calculated end. As the car rumbled toward the intersection where Gabino Barreda meets Benito Juarez Street, the scene appeared perfectly ordinary. A man stood on the sidewalk, a vendor of pumpkin seeds, his tray resting against his hip. To anyone else, he was just another face in the waking city, a humble merchant hoping for a few centavos. But this man, Juan Lopez Pardo, was the first gear in a machine of death. He watched the black Dodge approach, the sun glinting off its polished chrome. He knew his role perfectly. He had been paid to wait, to watch, and to speak. His eyes locked onto the figure of Villa, identifying his position within the vehicle. The assassins needed to know exactly where to aim their leaden storm, and Pardo was their eyes on the ground. The Dodge slowed as it prepared to navigate the sharp turn at the corner. The engine's growl softened to a low hum, and in that brief pocket of relative silence, Pardo raised his hand in a salute that looked like a gesture of respect. He drew a breath and shouted 2 words that had once rallied an entire nation to revolution: Viva Villa. On the battlefields of the North, this cry had been a symbol of hope and defiance. Today, it was a death knell. Pardo shouted the phrase twice, a prearranged code indicating that the general was sitting in the front seat, exposed and within reach. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the nearby buildings, hanging in the air for a fraction of a second before the world splintered into chaos. Behind the windows of a rented house overlooking the intersection, 7 men stood in the shadows. They had been waiting for months, their patience fueled by a mixture of political orders and personal vendettas. Among them were men like Jesus Salas Barraza and Meliton Lozoya, individuals who believed that by removing Villa, they were pruning a monster from the Garden of Mexico. They held their rifles with white-knuckled intensity, Winchesters and Springfields, cleaned and oiled for this singular purpose. They had even gone so far as to use hollow-point bullets, rounds specifically designed to expand upon impact, ensuring that no medical intervention could reverse what they were about to do. As Pardo's shout reached their ears, 7 fingers tightened on 7 triggers. Then the intersection erupted. The first shot was a sharp crack that shattered the morning's peace, followed instantly by a relentless, rhythmic drumming of gunfire. Over 40 bullets tore through the air in a matter of seconds. The black Dodge became a sieve of metal and glass. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of lead striking steel and the shattering of the windshield. Villa, ever the soldier, instinctively reached for his pistol, but the sheer volume of the ambush left no room for defense. 9 of those 40 rounds found their mark, striking the general in the head and chest. The man who had survived 100 battles and evaded the entire United States Army was being dismantled by a hail of lead on a quiet street corner in Parral. Inside the car, the violence was absolute. Colonel Miguel Trillo was hit repeatedly, his body slumping over the side of the door as he attempted to shield his commander. The interior of the Dodge, once a place of quiet conversation about the future of the hacienda, was now a scene of utter devastation. The engine, still running for a few moments, began to cough and sputter as the radiator was pierced. One of the bodyguards, Ramon Contreras, managed to scramble from the wreckage, wounded and bleeding, but the rest were caught in the crossfire. The car eventually drifted forward, coming to a halt against a telegraph pole, its front wheels spinning fruitlessly in the dirt. The smell of burnt powder and gasoline filled the air, mixing with the dust kicked up by the volley. As the echoes of the 40 shots finally faded, a terrifying silence reclaimed the intersection of Gabino Beretta and Juarez. The smoke from the rifles drifted lazily from the windows of the apartment, a gray shroud over the cobblestones. The assassins did not flee immediately. They watched from their vantage point, making sure the movement within the car had ceased. There were no last words, no dramatic speeches. The general lay slumped over the steering wheel, his life extinguished in the span of a single turn. The pumpkin seed vendor was gone, having vanished into the alleyways the moment the first trigger was pulled. The plan had been executed with chilling precision, leaving the Centaur of the North motionless in the driver's seat of his beloved Dodge. The local police and federal troops, who usually patrolled these streets with frequency, were nowhere to be found. They had been ordered away earlier that morning, cleared out to create a vacuum where this violence could occur without interference. It was a silence bought and paid for with 50,000 pesos. As the sun continued its climb, illuminating the more than 40 bullet holes that now decorated the car, the reality of the moment began to sink into the witnesses who peeked from behind their curtains. Pancho Villa was dead. The revolution had lost its most thunderous voice, not on a battlefield of glory, but in a dusty intersection where the only witness was the empty tray of a seed vendor and the smell of cooling lead. The air over Gabino Beretta Street did not clear all at once. It hung heavy with the acrid scent of cordite and the fine, golden dust of Chihuahua. Following the final thunderous volley of the rifles, a silence descended that was almost as deafening as the gunfire itself. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind that only follows an event that has permanently altered the landscape of history. There were no shouts from the hidden assassins, and no cries for help from within the vehicle. Instead, there was only the rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine and the soft, agonizing sound of fluid dripping onto the parched earth. The heat of the morning turned the street into a stagnant kiln where time seemed to have slowed to a crawl. In this stillness, the transition from life to legend began. The vehicle sat like a broken monument against the trunk of a large tree. It was a 1919 Dodge Brothers touring car, a machine that had once symbolized Pancho Villa's transition from a guerrilla horseman to a man of modern substance. Now it was a mangled husk of steel and glass. Over 40 bullet holes riddled the black bodywork, looking like dark, jagged eyes staring from the metal. The windshield had been reduced to shimmering diamonds, scattered across the dashboard and the floorboards. Inside, the luxury of the leather seats had been shredded into ribbons, the stuffing venting out like white feathers in a storm. The smell of gasoline and oil mixed with the metallic copper scent of blood, creating a perfume of violent finality. It was no longer a vehicle. It was a sarcophagus of wood and iron, resting at an angle that suggested a desperate struggle for control. Slumped over the wooden steering wheel was the man tasked with the impossible, steering the Centaur of the North through the valley of death. Rosalio Rosales, the driver, had stayed at his post until the very end. His hands still loosely gripped the rim of the wheel, a silent testament to his final reflex to pull the car away from the barrage. The front of his shirt was stained a deep, dark crimson, the fabric clinging to his skin in the oppressive heat. He had been a man of quiet competence, a shadow behind the great general, but in this quiet street, his sacrifice was laid bare. There was a tragic dignity in his posture, a driver who had followed his commander into the final turn of a road they had traveled many times before, but from which they would never return. In the passenger area, the chaos of the interior was even more profound. Miguel Trillo, the general's personal secretary and most trusted confidant, lay amidst a sea of papers and personal effects. He had been the man of records, the organizer of the Canutillo estate, and the one who had attempted to turn a revolutionary army into a thriving agricultural community. Now those documents were scattered and stained, fluttering slightly in the breeze that drifted through the shattered windows. Trillo's face was turned toward the floor, his body tangled with the remnants of the luggage they had been carrying back from Parral. Beside him, the assistant Daniel Tamyo was also motionless. These were not the fierce cavalrymen of the golden years, but the administrative heart of Villa's new life, and their presence here emphasized the mundane nature of the trip that had ended in such calculated slaughter. Then there was the man himself. Francisco Villa, the man who had survived 1,000 battles and 100 betrayals, was finally still. He was slumped toward the right side of the car, his large frame partially resting against the seat where Trillo lay. The centaur of the north looked smaller in death, his legendary energy having finally left the mortal coil. His clothes, the simple attire of a rancher, were riddled with the marks of the ambush, multiple bullet wounds that had struck him with such force that his death was nearly instantaneous. The light in his eyes, which had once blazed with a fire that could move armies, was gone, replaced by a vacant stare toward the empty street he had once walked as a conqueror. The warrior who had eluded entire nations was now a stationary figure in a landscape of quiet, settling dust. The surrounding houses remained shuttered, their residents paralyzed by the realization of what had just occurred. Behind the thick adobe walls, the people of Parral listened to the silence, waiting for a sign that the danger had passed. They knew the sound of revolution, but this was different. This was a calculated execution. The absence of the federal troops and the local police, who usually patrolled Gabino Beretta with regularity, was now a glaring, silent admission of complicity. No sirens wailed, and no authorities rushed to the scene. There was only the sun, the dust, and the broken car. Soon, the news would spread that the Lion of the North had been tamed by Lade. But for now, there was only the wreckage and the heavy heat of a July morning in Chihuahua, where a legend was dying and a ghost was being born. Before the dust had even settled on the streets of Parral, we must look back to the years of quiet. To understand why a man like Francisco Villa had to be erased, one must understand the kingdom he built in the high desert of Durango. In 1920, the revolutionary general had finally laid down his arms, trading the chaos of the battlefield for the rhythmic labor of the earth. The Mexican government, weary of a decade of blood, had granted him the sprawling hacienda of Canutillo. It was a massive estate, thousands of acres of sun-baked land and rugged mountains, intended by the politicians in the capital to be a gilded cage. But for Villa, it became a final, ambitious experiment in social order. Imagine the vast silence of the highlands, where the only sound is the wind whistling through the dry brush and the distant lowing of cattle against the backdrop of the Sierra Madre. At Canutillo, the transition was profound and deeply personal. The man who had once commanded the division of the North, leading tens of thousands of men in desperate, thunderous charges, now woke to the sound of a different bell. He rose before the sun, as he always had, but instead of checking the horizon for federal troops, he inspected the irrigation ditches. He had brought hundreds of his most loyal soldiers with him, the Dorados, the Golden Ones, and turned them into a productive agricultural colony. They were no longer guerrillas hiding in caves. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, and farmers. Yet they still walked with the straight backs of soldiers, their eyes scanning the hills with a practiced, restless vigilance. The air at the hacienda often smelled of damp earth and fresh wood smoke, a peaceful scent that masked the volatile history of the men who lived within its thick adobe walls. Villa poured himself into the role of the master of Canutillo with a feverish intensity. He established a school for the children of his workers, insisting that education was the only way to truly liberate the people. He often sat in the back of the classrooms, watching the young faces, perhaps seeing a future he had never been allowed to have as an illiterate fugitive. He imported modern machinery from the United States, gleaming steel tractors and threshers that were marvels of the age. The hacienda became a model of efficiency, a self-sustaining world where the ghosts of the revolution seemed to have finally found rest. He took immense pride in the rows of corn and the thriving wheat fields, finding a strange, quiet solace in the predictable growth of the seasons. It was a life of labor and order, far removed from the stench of gunpowder and the screams of the dying. However, the peace of Canutillo was an illusion, a fragile shell over a core of political fire. Though he lived the life of a rancher, the shadow of the centaur of the north never truly left him. He kept a personal guard of 50 men, all veterans of his bloodiest campaigns, who slept with their rifles within reach. The Mexican government, led by President Alvaro Obregón and his powerful interior minister, Plutarco Elias Calles, watched the growth of Canutillo with a growing sense of dread. To them, Villa was not a reformed farmer. He was a sleeping giant. They knew that if Pancho Villa chose to speak, the masses across the north would listen with religious devotion. Every time he stepped off his land, every time he cashed a check at the bank in Parral, the halls of power in Mexico City trembled with the weight of his potential return. The tension reached a breaking point during a fateful interview with a journalist named Regino Hernandez Livas. As they sat in the shade of the hacienda, Villa spoke with a candor that would prove his ultimate undoing. He expressed his opinions on the upcoming election of 1924, hinting that he might support a rival faction. He spoke openly of his ability to mobilize his former soldiers in a matter of hours. He claimed he could put 1,000 men in the field in 48 hours if the country needed him. His voice was soft, but the words carried the weight of a decade of war. For Obregón and Calles, this was the final confirmation they needed. The master of Canutillo was still a general at heart, and as long as he drew breath, the stability of their regime was in jeopardy. The farmer was still a threat. The landscape of Canutillo, with its golden fields and stone walls, began to feel like a fortress under a slow and invisible siege. Villa knew the eyes of his enemies were upon him, following his every move through the binoculars of hidden spies. He rarely left the safety of the estate, but the necessity of business and family often drew him back to the town of Parral. Each journey was a calculated risk, a passage through territory where the old grudges of the revolution still simmered like hot coals beneath the sand. He moved through the world with the heavy grace of a man who had survived 1,000 deaths. Yet the quiet of the hacienda could no longer drown out the whispers of conspiracy. The machinery of his assassination was already in motion, fueled by the terrifying realization that the peaceful farmer of Durango could once again become the revolutionary who had shaken the very foundations of the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon of the Durango plains, casting long, purple shadows across the adobe walls, the stage was set for the final act. The year was 1923. Villa's retirement had lasted only 3 short years, a brief interlude of construction and growth in a life defined by conflict. The political climate of Mexico was a tinderbox, and the master of Canutillo was the spark that the government dared not allow to fly. He prepared for his final trip to Parral, unaware that the shuttered windows and silent streets we described were already waiting for him. The transition from the tranquility of the farm to the violence of the street was nearly complete, and the legend of the revolution was about to collide with the cold, hard reality of a political execution. Breathe slowly now, as we move closer to that final, dusty corner in the heart of Parral. The dust in Hidalgo del Parral has a way of settling on everything, a fine, golden powder that tastes of ancient stone and dry earth. In the early months of 1923, that dust felt heavier than usual, as if the very air was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. While Pancho Villa lived out his semi-retirement at the sprawling Hacienda de Canutillo, the world around him was not as peaceful as the rolling hills of Durango might suggest. To many, he was still the centaur of the North, a hero who had survived 1,000 battles and outrun an entire American army. But to a small, quiet group of men in the shadows of Parral, he was something else entirely. He was a ghost that refused to stay buried, a reminder of blood spilled and fortunes lost. The revolution had technically ended, but for some, the war had simply moved indoors, into the hushed corners of cantinas and the dimly lit rooms of rented houses where the seeds of betrayal began to take root in the parched soil of resentment. At the center of this growing darkness stood a man named Meliton Lozoya. Meliton was not a soldier of grand standing or a politician with a silver tongue. He was a man of the land, a former administrator of the very hacienda where Villa now slept. Before the government had gifted the 25,000-acre estate to Villa as part of a peace treaty in 1920, the land belonged to the Jurado family. During the chaotic years of the revolution, while the rightful owners were far away in the capital, Meliton had looked after the property. But he had done more than just watch over the cattle and the crops. He had quietly siphoned away wealth, embezzling funds and selling off assets that weren't his to touch. He likely thought the chaos would never end, that no one would ever come to balance the books. He had carved out a comfortable life for himself in the cracks of a broken nation, never imagining that the most feared man in Mexico would one day become his landlord and his accountant. When Villa moved into Canutillo, he did not come to play the part of a gentle farmer. He brought with him the same terrifying precision he used on the battlefield. It didn't take long for him to discover the discrepancies in Meliton's ledgers. Imagine the scene. The heat of the afternoon sun beating down on the thick adobe walls, the sound of Villa's heavy boots echoing in the courtyard as he called Meliton into his study. Villa demanded that the administrator repay a staggering sum of 80,000 pesos, money that Meliton had long since spent or hidden. The ultimatum was clear and delivered with the cold, steady gaze that had made generals tremble. Pay the debt or face the consequences. For Meliton Lozoya, there was no way to produce such a fortune. He realized with a chilling certainty that his life was now on a countdown. He could not run from Villa, and he could not pay him. There was only one path left for a man backed into a corner. He would have to remove the threat entirely. But Meliton knew he could not act alone. He began to reach out, testing the waters of Parral, looking for others whose hearts were hardened by the same hatred. He didn't have to look far. He found a willing partner in Jesus Salas Barraza, a state legislator from Durango who held a deep, personal grudge against the former revolutionary. Together, they began to weave a web that stretched from the local streets of Parral all the way to the halls of power in Mexico City. They found men like the Herrera family, who had seen their kin executed by Villa's orders years prior. To these men, the conspiracy wasn't just about money or politics. It was a sacred duty of blood for blood. They met in secret, their voices barely whispers over the sound of the wind, rattling the wooden shutters. They talked of the way Villa drove his car, the routes he took, and the small, predictable habits that would eventually lead to his undoing. The air in those rooms must have been thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the metallic tang of sharpened steel. The conspirators eventually rented a small house on Cal Juarez, a narrow street that Villa frequently traveled when he visited the city. It was a strategic choice. positioned perfectly near a sharp corner where the car would be forced to slow down. For 3 long months, the assassins lived in that house like shadows. They watched from behind heavy curtains, tracking every movement of the black Dodge touring car. They watched as Villa waved to children, as he laughed with his companions, and as he grew comfortable in the supposed safety of his retirement. They even recruited a local pumpkin seed vendor to stand on the corner. He was to be their eyes and ears, a humble street merchant who would provide the final signal. One shout of "Viva Villa" meant the target was in the front seat. 2 shouts meant he was in the back. It was a plan built on patience, fueled by the slow-burning fire of 100 local grievances that had finally found a single, deadly focus. As the summer of 1923 reached its peak, the atmosphere in Parral became electric with an unspoken tension. The conspirators had their rifles cleaned, their positions marked, and their hearts steeled. Meleton Lozoya had turned his personal fear of financial ruin into a collective mission of execution. The seeds of betrayal had been sown in the embezzled accounts of a lonely hacienda, watered by the tears of mourning families, and tended by politicians who wanted a legend silenced. They were no longer just men with a plan. They were the gears of a clock that was about to strike its final hour. Every morning that Villa drove into town, he was passing through a valley of eyes that saw not a hero, but a target. The stage was now fully dressed. The actors were in place, and the silence of the desert was about to be shattered by 40 shots that would echo through history forever. The dusty artery of Cal Gabino Beretta was not a place one would expect to become a site of historical rupture. It was a narrow, unassuming stretch of road in the heart of Parral, where the air often tasted of dry earth and the exhaust of the occasional motor car. To the men watching from the shadows, however, this street was a tactical bottleneck, a place where the mighty centaur of the north would eventually have to slow his pace. The logistics of the hit required a vantage point that was both intimate and invisible, a place where the killers could exist as part of the architecture itself. They found exactly what they needed in a modest house on the corner, where the street made a sharp, deliberate turn. This curve was the flaw in the rhythm of the city, a point where any driver, no matter how skilled or hurried, would be forced to navigate with caution. It was here that Meleton Lozoya and Jesus Salas Barraza decided to plant their seeds of vengeance, renting 2 ground-floor rooms with windows that offered an unobstructed view of the approaching dust clouds. Acquiring the space required a delicate touch of deception. The conspirators did not arrive as a band of armed revolutionaries. They came as quiet tenants, men seeking a place to stay while they tended to business in the city. The rooms at numbers 7 and 9, Gabino Beretta, were sparse, with thick adobe walls that held the heat of the afternoon long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. Inside, the floor was cool underfoot, and the light that filtered through the wooden shutters was sliced into thin, golden ribbons. For those who inhabited these spaces, the rooms became a world of stillness and observation. They brought in minimal furniture, perhaps a few chairs and a table, but the primary focus of the room was the window. They spent their initial days adjusting the slats of the shutters, finding the exact angle that allowed them to see the street without being seen from the outside. It was a study in patience, a long-form meditation on the habits of a man who believed he had finally found peace. As the weeks turned into months, the weight of the weight began to settle over the group like the fine silt of the Chihuahua desert. They remained in those rooms for nearly 3 months, a duration that required an almost supernatural level of discipline. Imagine the monotony of those hours. The assassins sat in the dimness, listening to the sounds of Parral waking up, the distant ring of church bells, and the shouts of vendors selling sweets and corn. They ate simple meals in silence, their ears constantly tuned for the specific, throaty rumble of a 1922 Dodge Brothers engine. Every time a car approached, the room would go deathly still. Hearts would hammer against ribs as a hand reached for a rifle, only for the tension to dissipate when a different vehicle passed by. They learned the patterns of the street with the intimacy of a lover. They knew when the shadows would reach the opposite wall and when the local dogs would bark at a passing carriage. They were not just waiting for an opportunity. They were waiting for the perfect alignment of fate and routine. The surveillance was clinical. They noted that Pancho Villa frequently traveled from his sprawling hacienda at Canutillo into Parral to handle banking or to visit the various women who still held his heart. He was a creature of habit, often driving the car himself, his hands steady on the steering wheel. Through the cracks in the shutters, the men watched him pass. They counted the number of bodyguards in the back seat and noted the speed at which he took the corner. They noticed that as the summer progressed, his security seemed to relax. The fierce Dorados, the elite guards who had once been his shadow, were fewer in number on these domestic trips. It was a fatal oversight. The assassins used this time to practice their movements, silently drawing their weapons and aiming at the empty space where a driver's head would soon be. They calibrated their rifles for the distance of 45 yards, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no room for error. The room with a view was no longer just a rental. It was a laboratory of death, where every variable was being measured and accounted for. In the final days of 1923, the plan reached its terminal phase. The role of the lookout was solidified. A man named Juan Lopez Sainz Pardo was chosen to stand near the street, disguised perhaps as a simple vendor or a bystander enjoying the morning air. He would be the one to bridge the gap between the target and the hidden gunmen. The signal was as simple as it was chilling. If Villa was in the car, the lookout would remove his hat or wipe his face with a red handkerchief, a gesture that looked innocent to a passerby but was a death sentence to those inside the house. Within the 2 rooms, the 8 or 9 assassins checked their ammunition for the 1,000th time. They used expanding bullets, designed to cause maximum damage upon impact. The air in the rooms grew thick with the smell of gun oil and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. They were no longer just men. They were the mechanisms of a trap that had been set months ago, now waiting for the spring to be touched. On the night of July 19th, the atmosphere in Parral was deceptively calm. Villa was in town, sleeping just 2 blocks away from where his killers sat in the dark. In rooms 7 and 9, there was no more talk of strategy, only the heavy silence of men who knew that the next sunrise would change the course of Mexican history. They watched the moonlight crawl across the floorboards, illuminating the barrels of their Winchesters. They had accounted for the hole in the road that the city workers had conveniently dug, an obstacle that would force the car to slow down even further. They had accounted for the absence of the federal garrison, which had been moved out of town for a supposed training exercise. Everything was in place. As the first gray light of July 20th began to bleed through the shutters, the men took their positions. They pressed their faces against the cool adobe, their eyes fixed on the curve of the road, waiting for the black silhouette of the Dodge to emerge from the morning mist. Inside the rented rooms at the corner of Juarez Street and Gabino Barreda, the air had grown heavy and stagnant. For 3 months, this small space served as a sanctuary of shadows for men whose names would soon be etched into the darker pages of history. The scent of stale tobacco smoke mingled with the sharp, acidic tang of gun oil and the earthy smell of sun-baked dust drifting through the narrow window slits. These men were known as the 7 Rifles, or perhaps 9, depending on the account you choose to believe. They lived in a world of whispers and waiting, their eyes constantly fixed on the cobblestone street below. They watched the city of Parral wake and sleep, their fingers growing accustomed to the cold weight of the oiled metal they cradled. Mellet N. Lozoya was the man who had provided the bridge between grievance and action. Once the administrator of the Canutillo hacienda, he had been accused of embezzling vast sums of money before the land was turned over to Villa. To Lozoya, the general was not a folk hero, but a looming threat who had demanded repayment on pain of death. Desperation is a powerful motivator, and Lazoya had used his intimate knowledge of the area to select the perfect location for an ambush. He chose a spot where the road narrowed, and the car would be forced to slow down to a crawl. In the dim light of the apartment, he was a restless figure, driven by the knowledge that he had to kill or be killed. If Lazoya was the provider of the location, Jess S. Salas Barraza was the provider of the resolve. A congressman from Durango and a veteran of the revolution, Barraza viewed the assassination as a political necessity. He believed that the peace of the nation was an impossibility as long as Pancho Villa remained alive in his fortified ranch. Barraza was a man of cold, surgical focus. He did not share the nervous agitation of the others. Instead, he spent the long hours of the afternoon cleaning his Springfield rifle with a rhythmic, almost meditative patience. He was the one who coordinated the squad, ensuring that each man knew his window and his angle. He was preparing to fire the shot that would claim the life of a legend. The rest of the group was composed of men like Juan L. Pez S. Ents Pardo, Librado Martinez, and the Guerra brothers. Many of them were tied to the long-standing blood feuds that defined the era. Several were connected to the Herrera family, a clan that had seen almost every male member executed by Villa's orders after a bitter betrayal years earlier. For them, the rifles were not tools of politics, but instruments of a much older justice. They were men of the countryside, used to the slow pacing of a hunt and the silence of the high desert. They slept on thin mats and ate simple meals, their existence reduced to the singular goal of waiting for the sound of a specific engine to echo through the plaza. The weapons they carried were a collection of lethal precision, including Winchester carbines and high-powered rifles, some allegedly sourced from the Mexican military itself. But the most chilling detail of their preparation lay in the ammunition. They did not use standard rounds. Instead, they took the time to painstakingly modify each bullet, carving small crosses into the lead tips to create expanding dum-dum rounds. These were designed to shatter upon impact, ensuring that even a single hit would cause catastrophic damage. They understood the stakes. Villa was a man who had survived dozens of battles and 5 previous assassination attempts. They were not merely looking to wound him. They were looking to erase him, using every ounce of technical skill to tip the scales in their favor. The patience required for such a task was immense. They had to ignore the scorching afternoon heat that turned the apartment into an oven. They had to watch Villa pass by several times, holding their fire because he was surrounded by his 50 loyal bodyguards, the Dorados. They knew a premature strike would mean their own deaths. They waited for the one morning when the general's guard was down, when he would travel with only a few companions. They memorized the rhythm of his life, his visits to friends, and the specific way his Dodge Brothers car handled the turn onto Juarez Street. As the sun rose on the morning of July 20th, 1923, the wait finally came to an end. The men took their positions at the windows, their rifles loaded and their sights aligned. Outside, a man named Juan L. Pez stood ready, ostensibly a simple vendor of pumpkin seeds. He was the final piece of the plan. He was to shout Viva Villa once if the general was driving, or twice if he was in the back seat. This simple, haunting cry would be the trigger for the carnage to follow. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. The 7 rifles were ready. The long months of shadow and dust were over, and the first rumble of an engine was beginning to vibrate through the floor. The sun climbed higher over the city of Parral on that fateful Friday morning of July 20th, 1923. In the dry, thin air of the Chihuahua Highlands, the light has a way of sharpening every edge, turning the shadows into deep, ink-black pools against the bleached stone of the buildings. On any other day, the streets would have been punctuated by the rhythmic, heavy footfalls of the federal garrison. The soldiers were a constant, visible reminder of the government's watchful eye. their uniforms a dusty olive drab that blended into the desert landscape. But as Pancho Villa's open-top Dodge moved slowly through the narrow corridors of the city, an eerie stillness had settled over the military quarters. The barracks, which usually buzzed with the sounds of morning drills, the clatter of mess tins, and the low murmur of men in service, stood hauntingly quiet, as if the very stone were holding its breath. This silence was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated void, a hollow space carved out of the city's defenses by a man Villa considered a friend, or at the very least, a reliable associate. Colonel Felix Lara was the commander of the federal troops in Parral, the man responsible for maintaining the fragile peace of the district. Only days before, Villa had reached out to him using a peculiar domestic sort of code. He had sent word to Lara asking for 3 cheeses to be delivered to him on the outskirts of the city. To the uninitiated, it sounded like a simple request for local produce, but to Villa and Lara, it was a signal for a 3-man armed escort. Villa wanted protection, a small shield of federal steel to accompany him as he navigated the political minefields of the town. He expected the soldiers to be there, watching the corners and scanning the rooftops. But the cheeses never arrived, and the escort never materialized. Instead, at roughly 8 in the morning, just as the heat began to bake the clay of the streets, Colonel Lara had given a curious order. The entire garrison, hundreds of trained soldiers, was to march out of Parral immediately. They were headed toward the nearby village of Machurana, leaving the city's heart completely exposed. As the long line of infantry and cavalry kicked up clouds of fine, white dust that hung in the stagnant air, the townspeople watched in silence. There was no urgent threat on the horizon, no rebel uprising reported in the hills, and no emergency that required the sudden evacuation of the military presence. There was only the sound of marching feet fading into the distance, leaving the street of Gabino Barrera strangely vacant. The absence felt heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the few pedestrians who remained in the square. The official reason given for this mass exodus was almost insulting in its transparency. Colonel Lara claimed that his men needed to conduct target practice and rehearse for the grand military parade of the 16 de September. It was an explanation that withered under the slightest scrutiny. The Independence Day celebrations were still nearly 2 months away, an eternity in the fast-moving world of post-revolutionary Mexican politics. To send an entire garrison out into the blistering heat for parade drills in July was a logistical absurdity that spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. The target practice was a convenient fiction, a narrative shield designed to provide Lara and his superiors with plausible deniability. They weren't ignoring the danger. They were simply elsewhere, distracted by the choreographed steps of a celebration that had yet to arrive, while the real action was prepared in the shadows of the city they had just abandoned. Behind this military theater lay a much darker transaction, one measured in gold rather than tradition. History suggests that the silence of the garrison had a specific price tag, 50,000 pesos. This sum, a fortune at the time, was allegedly funneled through the hands of Plutarco Elias Calls, a powerful figure in the central government who viewed Villa not as a retired general, but as a sleeping lion who might wake at any moment to challenge the presidency. The bribe ensured that when the first shots rang out, there would be no federal response. No soldiers would run to the sound of the gunfire, no patrols would cut off the escape routes of the assassins, and no officer would stand in the way of the men waiting behind the windows of the house on the corner. The government hadn't just looked away, it had systematically cleared the path for the bullets. The payment turned the protectors of the city into silent accomplices. As the 1919 Dodge rounded the final corners toward the ambush site, the lack of a military presence must have felt palpable to the men inside. Pancho Villa, a man who had survived 1,000 battles and countless betrayals, was driving through a city that had been stripped of its law. The absence of the garrison turned Parral into a controlled environment, a stage where the actors could perform their grim work without fear of interruption. There were no uniforms to offer a sense of order, no bayonets to glint in the sun, only the empty, dusty air and the heavy scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. The trap was now fully set, not just by the men with rifles, but by the commander who had led his soldiers away into the hills, leaving the centaur of the north to face his end alone. The silence of the garrison was the final piece of the conspiracy, a quiet guarantee that death would find its mark. The dust of Parral eventually settled, but the echo of those 40 rifle shots did not fade. Instead, they traveled southward, carried by the frantic clicking of telegraph keys, until they reached the heavy, ornate doors of the National Palace in Mexico City. Here, the air is different. It is cooler, thinner, and heavy with the scent of floor wax and old ink. The investigation into the death of Francisco Villa was never truly about the men who pulled the triggers in that cramped apartment on the corner of Gabino-Barreda Street. To understand the true architecture of this crime, we must move away from the blood-stained leather of the car and step into the labyrinthine corridors of power. It is here that the whispers of the presidency began to hum, weaving a story of state survival. In the summer of 1923, President Alvaro Obregón was a man obsessed with legitimacy. He was the one-armed giant of the revolution, now fighting a war of signatures and recognition. The Mexican government was desperate for the United States to formally recognize its authority, a move that would stabilize the economy and secure the new regime. This brought us to the intense negotiations of the Bucareli Treaty. Imagine the long, mahogany tables where diplomats sat, the air thick with the blue haze of tobacco smoke. The United States was wary. They remembered the raid on Columbus and saw Villa as a chaotic element who could ignite a firestorm at any moment. For the treaty to succeed, Mexico had to prove it was a land of order. In the eyes of the capital, Villa was a ghost that refused to stop walking. Then there was the matter of the 1924 election. Obregón could not run again. The Constitution forbade it. He had already chosen his successor, Plutarco Elias Calles, a man of iron will and sharp edges. But Calles was not universally loved. A rival faction was forming behind Adolfo de la Huerta, the man who had actually negotiated Villa's retirement years earlier. The political tension in Mexico City was like a piano wire stretched to the breaking point. From his ranch at Canutillo, Villa had begun to speak again. He spoke of his respect for de la Huerta and hinted that if the country needed him, he could mobilize 100,000 men in a single week. To Obregón and Calles, these weren't just boasts. They were a direct threat to the peaceful transition of power. The evidence of a higher conspiracy is etched into the very logistics of that July morning. Consider the curious absence of the military. Parral was a garrison town, yet on the day of the assassination, Colonel Felix Lara had ordered his troops out of the city for supposed maneuvers. They were miles away, practicing for a parade that was months in the future. It is a detail that feels too convenient to be accidental. And then there were the telegraph lines. Just as the ambush was executed, the lines connecting Parral to the outside world went dead. For hours, the news was trapped, giving the assassins ample time to vanish into the hills. It was a blackout orchestrated with professional precision, ensuring that the federal government could claim ignorance, while the authors of the crime sat safely in their offices. When the investigation finally reached the courts, it was a hollow performance. Jesús Salas Barraza, a state legislator with a personal grudge, stepped forward to claim full responsibility. He claimed it was a matter of private vengeance, an act to rid the world of a monster. It was the perfect narrative for a government looking to wash its hands of blood. Obregón initially feigned a desire for justice, but the wheels of the law turned with a suspicious, heavy lethargy. Barraza was sentenced to 20 years, a penalty that seemed to satisfy the public's hunger for a culprit. Yet, within only 3 months, he was pardoned by the governor and walked free. He would later be promoted within the very military that was supposed to have pursued him. The message was clear. The crime was a service to the state. As we look back through the layers of history, the shadow of the presidency looms larger than any local feud. The death of Pancho Villa was the final, brutal stroke of the revolution's closing chapter. It cleared the path for calls and ensured that the centralized power of Mexico City would never again be challenged by a caudillo from the north. The whispers of the presidency were not just rumors. They were the blueprints for a new era of control. In the quiet of the night, we realize that some crimes are so large they become part of the foundation of a nation. The investigation may have officially ended in 1923, but the questions remain, drifting like the smoke of a guttering candle in the dark, cold halls of historical memory. The dust of Parral had finally begun to settle by the year 1926. 3 years had passed since the morning of the ambush, and the physical memory of the revolutionary general was slowly being reclaimed by the earth of the Pantheon de Dolores. The cemetery was a place of heavy, sun-drenched silence during the day, where the rows of simple crosses stood like silent sentries under the vast Chihuahua sky. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thin and cold, and the shadows of the cypress trees lengthened into jagged fingers that seemed to reach for the resting places of the dead. Pancho Villa lay beneath a heavy slab of concrete, a fortification intended to keep him safe from the very world that had hunted him so relentlessly in life. Yet, in the quiet hours of early February, the sanctity of that stone was about to be shattered. It was on the night of either February 5th or 6th, 1926, that the silence of the graveyard was broken by the rhythmic, metallic scrape of tools against stone. Imagine the sound echoing in the stillness, the sharp click of a chisel, the dull thud of a crowbar prying at the lip of a tomb. It was back-breaking work, fueled by a dark and singular purpose. The grave robbers were not interested in gold or the silver trinkets of the afterlife. They worked with a surgical focus, navigating the layers of soil and debris until they reached the wooden casket. When the lid was finally forced open, the cold light of a moon or perhaps a flickering lantern revealed what remained of the man who had once commanded the division of the North. But the desecration did not stop at the opening of the coffin. In a final, grotesque act of violence, the intruders removed the head of Pancho Villa, severing it from the torso and vanishing into the darkness before the first light of dawn could expose their crime. The following morning, a caretaker making his rounds discovered the horror. The concrete cover had been heaved aside, and the interior of the grave was a chaotic mess of splinters and disturbed earth. The news rippled through Parral like a physical shock. The centaur of the North, even in death, could not find peace. The authorities were quickly summoned, and the investigation immediately turned toward the outsiders drifting through the region. Suspicion fell heavily upon a man named Emil Holmdahl. Holmdahl was a figure straight from the pages of a pulp novel, a Swedish-American soldier of fortune, a mercenary who had fought on nearly every side of the revolution. He had been seen loitering near the cemetery in the days leading up to the robbery, and his reputation as a treasure hunter made him a natural suspect. Within days, he and an associate named Alberto Parral were arrested and thrown into the local jail, while an enraged town clamored for justice. The interrogation of Holmdahl was a tense affair, yet he remained remarkably cool, denying any involvement in the theft. Curiously, he was released after just a few days, reportedly through the intervention of an influential American rancher named Ben Williams. This release only thickened the fog of conspiracy. Why would a wealthy American go to such lengths to free a common grave robber? Years later, stories began to emerge from the private journals and memoirs of those involved. It was whispered that Holmdahl had indeed taken the skull, not for himself, but for a buyer across the border. Rumors began to circulate of a mysterious airplane that had landed on a remote strip near Parral on the very night of the robbery, whisking a small, heavy package away into the safety of the northern skies. The price for the general's head was said to be $25,000, a staggering sum in 1926. But who would pay such a price for the skull of a dead revolutionary? This is where the narrative veers into the shadowed halls of power. One of the most persistent theories points toward the secret society at Yale University known as Skull and Bones. It is a group shrouded in ritual and mystery, with members who would go on to become presidents and captains of industry. The legend suggests that the society had a macabre tradition of collecting the remains of famous warriors to display in their campus headquarters, often called the Tomb. It is said that the skull of the Apache leader Geronimo was already in their possession, and that Pancho Villa's head was the ultimate trophy for their collection. Others point toward the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, who had lost millions of dollars in land and cattle during Villa's raids. For Hearst, perhaps the skull was a final, grim act of repossession, a way to own the man who had once defied him. To this day, the location of the skull remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Americas. When Villa's remains were eventually moved to the monument to the revolution in Mexico City in the 1970s, the coffin was famously light, and the head was notably absent. Some believe the skull sits in a glass case in Connecticut, surrounded by the secrets of the American elite. Others suggest it was buried on a ranch in the desert, or perhaps it never left Mexico at all, hidden away by a family who viewed the general as a saint rather than a bandit. As we sit here in the quiet of the present, the image of that empty grave in Parral serves as a reminder that some stories do not end with a funeral. The shadow of the grave robber remains, a lingering ghost in the story of a man who refused to stay buried. Close your eyes now, and let the mystery of the missing general fade into the soft rhythm of your breathing. You are safe in the silence. Sleep well. After the final echoes of the gunshots faded into the heavy air of Parral on that July morning in 1923, a strange and stifling silence settled over the state of Chihuahua. The dust kicked up by the heavy tires of the 1919 Dodge Roadster slowly began to fall, coating the scene in a fine, golden powder that seemed to age the tragedy instantly. In the rooms of power far away in Mexico City, the news of the assassination was met not with shock, but with a quiet, practiced composure. The centaur of the North was dead, and for those who navigated the shark-infested waters of post-revolutionary politics, his passing was less a tragedy and more a calculated relief. But for the people who had followed him through the smoke and fire of a decade of war, the silence was unbearable. It felt as though a great heartbeat had stopped, leaving the land cold and vulnerable. The legal aftermath was a spectacle of shadows. Jesus Salas Barraza, a deputy from Durango who had orchestrated the ambush, eventually emerged to claim responsibility. He did not skulk in the darkness like a common criminal. Instead, he confessed with a boldness that suggested he knew the hand of justice would be wearing a velvet glove. The trial was a somber parade through a system that had already decided its end. Barraza was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a number that sounds substantial on parchment, but proved to be as thin as a desert mist. Within a year, the governor of Chihuahua granted him a full pardon. He walked out of his cell and back into the light of the sun, a free man. It was a clear signal to the world that while Villa's body was in the ground, the political machinery that desired his end was still very much alive, turning its gears in the dark to ensure that no true retribution would ever be found. Even in death, peace remained elusive for the general. On a bone-chilling morning in February of 1926, a groundskeeper at the Dolers Cemetery in Parral made a discovery that would haunt the nation for a century. The heavy stone slab over Villa's grave had been pried open, the earth disturbed by hands that moved with a frantic, desperate energy. When the authorities peered into the splintered casket, they found a scene of gruesome desecration. The body of the revolutionary was there, but the head was gone, severed and stolen under the cover of a moonless night. The air in the cemetery that morning must have felt thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood. The theft of the skull turned a murder case into a macabre mystery that has never been solved. To this day, the empty space where his head once rested remains a void in the history of the Americas, a missing piece of a puzzle that refuses to be completed. The whispers regarding the missing skull traveled across borders and through the decades. Some spoke of an American mercenary named Emil Holmdahl, who was seen in Parral around the time of the theft, rumored to have been paid a king's ransom of $25,000 to deliver the head to a private collector. Others pointed toward the elite secret societies of northern universities in the United States, suggesting that the skull was taken as a trophy to be kept behind locked doors in a room filled with the relics of other fallen legends. The theories are many, and the evidence is scarce, leaving the head of Pancho Villa to exist only as a phantom in the imagination of historians and storytellers. This missing fragment of the man only served to deepen his myth, transforming him from a fallen leader into a ghostly figure that could never truly be buried or forgotten. In 1976, more than 50 years after the assassination, a final journey was prepared for the remains of the general. His body was exhumed from the quiet, sun-baked earth of Parral to be moved to the monument to the revolution in the heart of Mexico City. This massive stone structure, with its towering arches and cold copper dome, was designed to be a pantheon for the heroes of the war. There is a deep, quiet irony in his final resting place. Villa was laid to rest alongside the very men who had been his most bitter rivals and enemies in life, including Plutarco Elias Calls and Venustiano Carranza. In the silence of the monument's basement, the men who once fought for the soul of a nation now share the same cold stone. The air there is still, smelling of polished marble, and the weight of 1,000,000 footsteps that come to pay their respects to a history written in blood and fire. Today, Pancho Villa lives on in the Mexican consciousness as more than just a historical figure. He is an eternal symbol of the underdog. His face, with its characteristic mustache and piercing eyes, stares out from countless murals, his name invoked in songs that celebrate the spirit of resistance. To the people of the countryside, he is the ghost of the revolution, a guardian who rides through the canyons of Chihuahua whenever the wind blows too hard from the north. He represents the duality of the human spirit, capable of great cruelty and profound kindness, a bandit who dreamed of schools and a general who never stopped being a fugitive. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the vast, open horizons of the desert, where the purple mountains meet the velvet sky and the stars burn bright over the silent plains of Canutillo. The dust has settled, and the thunder of the horses has moved beyond the horizon. The story of the man who was both a hero and a villain is now a part of the earth itself, woven into the very fabric of the land he loved and fought for. The shadows of the past are long, but they are peaceful now, stretching out across the desert floor until they disappear into the night. Let the details of the trials and the mysteries of the missing skull drift away from your mind like smoke from a dying campfire. There is no more riding to be done, no more battles to win. The world is soft and still, and you are far away from the echoes of the revolution. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.